Okay, hello everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Security for Collections webinar. My name is Dyani Feige. I'm the Director of Preservation Services at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. And I'm very pleased to be presenting our first Regional Heritage Stewardship Program webinar of 2020. So for those of you who are new to the program, just a very quick intro. Let me make sure I have, okay. This initiative is, we're entering the second year of this round of the initiative. It's a program funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which my organization, the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, has partnered with the Utah Division of Arts and Museums and Utah Humanities to bring preservation services and training to the Intermountain West states, including Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, the surrounding region there as well. We will be back in the region in person in May, but until then we have some great webinars planned for you. So today's webinar will focus on issues of security for museum, library, and archive spaces, with an emphasis on the prevention of theft and vandalism. Nobody wants to think about these things, of course, but the better prepared you are, the quicker your institution can respond to issues like this. So just a tiny bit of housekeeping. If you're new to Zoom webinars, there are two options for interacting with me and other participants potentially. Those are the chat and the Q&A buttons. If you hit chat, that will send out questions or comments to everyone in the program. If you type in the Q&A box, that will send it directly to me. So if you have a question that you'd rather ask just to the speaker, you can go ahead and type it in a Q&A. I will take questions at the end, so we should have enough time, but please, if you have questions along the way, you're welcome to type them in the chat bar, but excuse me, in the chat box, but I might not get to them until the end. And another point is, at the very end, I will include my email address as well. There definitely may be questions that I can't answer, that I don't get to answer, or just conversations that you want a little more elaboration on. Please feel free to reach out via email to me at any point in the future. I will do my best to either answer your questions outright or direct you to someone who can. So, the goal of today's webinar is to introduce the basics of security for collecting institutions. I will cover some common security risks for institutions, the hazards they pose to your collections, and some of the preventive measures you can take. Many of these measures are actually low cost, or some even no cost, to implement, and quite a bit of it will be common sense. We will also discuss the steps it takes to establish a security plan. And in between, along the way, I have a few tales of strange collection thefts throughout history. After this webinar, you will get a post-webinar email just following up. Within that, we will include some documents which might be helpful once you begin thinking about security for your own collections. So there will be 4 supplementary documents that I'll send out as PDFs. If you are listening to this webinar later in recording, please just head to the end where you have my email address, and please reach out to me via email and I can send you those 4 documents as well. With that said, why is establishing a security plan important? This is one of those kind of common sense aspects, but I think it's worth mentioning, worth actually saying in words. Establishing a security plan helps to incorporate security measures into the day-to-day activities of an institution's staff. So it really, it makes security a concept that is thought about on an ongoing basis. It's not just a reactive concern if there is an incident, it's proactive consideration. So really building it into the day-to-day. And it also begins the conversation on what security means to your institution. Every institution will have different needs and concerns. And I mentioned at the beginning that this webinar is for all different types of collecting institutions. I think you'll see throughout that some of the concerns between, for example, library and archive collections are going to be a lot different from those facing museum or other more exhibit-oriented historic site type collecting institutions. So we'll talk about that kind of throughout the afternoon. We're going to go way back to the basics now and define the two big security risks institutions take, just so we are all on the same page. But as I mentioned at the top, primarily this afternoon, we are going to be talking about theft, the act or crime of stealing, and vandalism, the act of causing deliberate destruction of or damage to private or public property. The sociologist Sandy Cohen described 6 main motivations for theft or vandalism of library, archival, and museum collecting materials. Playful, as a joke or prank. Malicious, with the actual intention of causing harm. The point of the theft or vandalism is to cause that harm. Vindictive, as retribution for a perceived threat or slight. Acquisitive. So this is what we generally think of when we generally think of big art thefts, for example. The purpose is to acquire a specific object or objects for financial gain or some type of prestige. It's about the acquisition. Tactical, this is to advance some end rather than acquiring money, as in a student stealing a book from a university library because he or she needs it for a class and doesn't want to buy it, but also doesn't want to deal with checking it out and returning it. And then finally, ideological. These are theft and vandalism incidents that are carried out to further advance a particular cause or belief or send a message. An example of this would be the destruction of libraries or historic sites in times of war, book burning, or what some librarians refer to as freelance censors, people who steal books on a subject matter they have decided is controversial in order to restrict access to the information. In the museum context, it might be a visitor who takes issue with the imagery or iconography displayed in a particular museum artifact and wishes to damage it or steal it as kind of a protest mechanism. So we're going to talk about some of the kind of most common examples of theft and vandalism in collecting institutions, but I think obviously like any of these most common example sections in a talk, there are so many others, but these are just some of the things that we see perhaps the most often. Vandalism actually can tend to be fairly subtle most of the time. The cultural vandalism that gets in the news tends to be defacement of art in public places. Like this, the image to the right of the screen was a fairly high profile incident that occurred at the Whitney Museum in New York in 2014. But vandalism actually occurs just about every day in collecting institutions. Especially in libraries with circulating collections. I'm sure everyone has brought a book home from the local public library and opened it to see that pages were stuck together with an unknown substance or to find someone had highlighted sections. That unfortunately is vandalism, and it is quite common. In the exhibit setting, some of the more slightly innocuous forms of vandalism might be small acts of graffiti or tagging on an artifact or on a case. I was in a museum recently that they had a bench that was related to the civil rights movement, and someone apparently, because we mentioned it to the people working at the visitor services desk, this happened over and over. Someone stuck stickers on the bench that were in that kind of ideological protest to the message that this bench was representing. Common examples of theft in collecting institutions. In a library or archive, you know, there are the high profile big examples, but smaller instances of theft, like I mentioned, the student stealing from a university library, pages torn from books, documents that are removed from under-processed collections if researchers are able to use collections that have maybe not been fully described and processed to the level that staff would even notice that something was missing. On exhibit, one of the most common examples of theft on exhibit is exhibits that have a lot of small items that are perhaps densely installed, and visitors will just literally pocket them opportunistically. This is, you know, often an example of a playful theft where school groups will just do it as, you know, an act of a small prank. This image to the right here, this actually is an exhibit, a publicly accessible exhibit, and you can see it's so densely installed with very small artifacts and things overlaying each other. It would be probably pretty simple for a visitor to pocket something from that without being readily discovered. So what are some strategies for mitigating theft and vandalism risks in collections? Throughout the next portion of this webinar, we are going to take somewhat of a five-pronged approach: survey and assessment, policy development, including updating existing policies, but also creating new ones, looking at security both internal and external. These are physical measures which institutions can employ to increase security. Patron or visitor education. This is the part where you involve your library patrons or your museum visitors in helping to make the collection secure. This is also the most direct human interactive part of the equation. So this is a situation that some people might feel uncomfortable with. So we'll go over some ways to make this feel easier. And then finally, awareness of in-house security risks. Generally, in-house refers to employee, volunteer, or contractor theft, which is, of course, really unpleasant to talk about, but unfortunately accounts for a great deal and even a majority of theft from collections. So the first step in any solid security plan is to conduct a security survey, which, like an object survey, evaluates the current state of your institution. But of course, in this case, focusing specifically on collections security. A security survey evaluates collection protection strategies that are already in place for storage, for items on exhibition, and in transit. And that can mean anything from, you know, the big examples of things being in transit, actually going to other institutions on loan, but also smaller examples as well, just moving throughout the space, moving throughout the building, the museum. The security survey reassesses current policies and procedures. So things like patron registration, if researchers are directly using collections, reading room policies, access and handling policies, and key control for spaces that are kept locked. The survey identifies areas of potential risk: the interior and exterior of the building, faulty or insufficient locks or insufficient security procedures for keeping spaces locked, inadequate sight lines. Determines which problems or concerns have occurred in the past, and in order to identify areas in which the collection is most at risk, because of course if something has occurred in the past and full steps weren't necessarily taken to change the circumstances surrounding that, it's going to be an ongoing risk. And then it also provides all of the information which you will need to create an operating security plan, which we'll cover in the next section on policy development. By conducting that security assessment, you are basically halfway to creating a security plan and identifying the policies you'll need. The assessment helps to create an outline, identify weaknesses and also strengths, and establishes priorities so that the task of coming up with a plan seems less daunting. You're not looking at just the overall big picture of security as one enormous blob of overwhelming, daunting something to conquer, but you're able to break the problem and issue down into smaller incremental chunks. So with that, you're well on your way to policy development. Again, as we discussed earlier, policy development might mean updating policies the institution currently has in place, or it can mean creating entirely new ones. There are several key policies which can have a significant impact on the security of your collections. After you complete a security survey and assessment, you will most likely be aware of the policies which are needed to improve the safety and security of collections. This might well include a security plan, a visitor access / handling and use policy, an exhibition policy, and if objects from your collection are loaned to other institutions, a loan policy. Not all of these policies will apply to every institution. For example, even some exhibiting institutions don't regularly do outside loans. In the case of libraries and archival collections, some of you might not even be putting your documents or books on display, so you might not even need an exhibition policy. You might also choose, depending on the way that you're interacting with visitors and or researchers, you might choose to combine the visitor access and handling and use policies or keep them separate. Exhibiting institutions where researchers are infrequently or never directly interacting with collections other than viewing them on exhibit, you would have much different considerations in terms of visitor access versus handling and use. You know your institution and are probably aware of what might work best for you. So I'll discuss all of these a little bit more individually as we go along. The security plan, of course, is maybe the most crucial policy for institutional security. That might kind of go without saying, but again, I think worth putting in words. The security plan encompasses other policies, as well as practical information needed to provide a secure environment and respond to potential security threats. So this security plan includes information about security systems, and that's both kind of mechanical systems like alarm codes, but also contact numbers and call lists, as well as service information of if you're working with outside contractors or vendors. A key control policy. Even for very, very small institutions, this is extremely important because it limits access only to those who need it. And a strong key control policy tracks the number of people who have access. It includes procedures for requesting employee access, as well as criteria for granting access, procedures for allowing access to outside individuals like contractors, and procedures for dealing with lost or stolen keys. Copies of all policies and procedures relating to security should be included in the overall security plan. So this includes the access policy, the overall exhibition policy, and loan policy if applicable. The plan will also have a checklist of preventative tasks, and these tasks are the things that you'll identify during that survey that need to be accomplished in order to make the collections more secure. I'll go over some of these tasks shortly. And last but not least, it's very important to have procedures in place to address a security breach or theft if something happens. Obviously, nobody wants to think about this happening, but it's much better to be prepared to make dealing with an unpleasant situation a little bit easier if necessary. So this will include things like contact numbers for first responders, insurance information, and procedures for reporting theft. This may or may not be part of an overall emergency management plan or guidelines. It is a little bit separate because theft and vandalism are not necessarily always elevated to the level of an emergency, but since some of the protocols and information that you'll need to gather is going to be similar between those two different types of plans, sometimes some institutions kind of consolidate them together. So next I'll be going over the access/handling and use policy, and then we'll talk briefly about the importance of exhibition and loan policies. An access or handling and use policy provides guidelines for individuals from the outside, so patrons, researchers, visitors, however you refer to them, on procedures for directly accessing and using collections materials. So this is, again, if your institution is only exhibiting and researchers are never directly using your collections for research, this may not be quite as applicable, but certainly can have applicable sections and considerations as well. It also clarifies points of the policy from the type of personal belongings that might be allowed into a research space, whether or not visitors can take bags into collection spaces, and again, that's collections research spaces or exhibit spaces, or if they need to be checked prior to leaving. The policy outlines what a patron, researcher, or visitor needs in order to register. So this can include personal identification and personal information forms, as well as reference requests for materials. This is also a good place to provide written guidelines for the safe handling of materials, including things like photocopying and reshelving for, again, for library and archive collections. If your institution regularly or even just occasionally mounts displays, it is a really good idea to have some exhibition policy. This policy covers all aspects of exhibition, including environment, exposure to light, and length of time objects are on display. But today, of course, we're focused on the security aspect of this policy. So this can include provisions for security, outlining the type of display used and whether it's locked or alarmed. Exhibit arrangements with other institutions who have loaned your institution materials. And that might include waiver forms in case of damage or threats. Insurance information for objects loaned from other institutions. And then finally, a general statement of security. So how, on kind of a bigger picture level than, for example, locked display cases, how is your institution providing security to items on exhibits? Are you doing walkthroughs and monitoring the space on a routine basis to make sure everything is exactly where it's supposed to be, etc.? Not all exhibition policies are going to have the same level of detail in terms of security. It really depends on, again, kind of the extent of exhibition at your institution, whether or not your institution displays loaned objects on a regular basis. But I will say that even if your institution only displays objects from your collection, it's still a really good idea to have an exhibition policy in place. This is an example of some of the language used in the security section of the exhibition policy at the Meaford Museum in Canada. It's short but effective. This is the entirety of the security section. So the Meaford Museum will provide a safe, stable, and secure environment for all objects on exhibit. All borrowed items will receive proper care and handling. The museum will only exhibit objects that can withstand the stress of exhibition and will remove any object that may deteriorate during its time on display. Your institution, again, may or may not loan out objects to other institutions, but if you do, a loan policy is essential, even if it's an institution that you have a very ongoing relationship with, you know, a neighboring historical society, a museum just one town over that you're routinely kind of trading things back and forth for exhibit. It's essential to have this in writing. This policy will define guidelines for the care, handling, transport, security, installation, and exhibition of objects which your institution lends to other institutions. This is really crucial for ensuring that objects from your collection are safe, even when they're not under your immediate care. Here's a good example of the language used in the security portion of a loan policy. This is for the library from the library at the University of California, San Diego. So in this loan policy, it states that the borrower will receive, store, and display the items in a secure, environmentally sound area. A signed and completed facilities report must be submitted and approved, and including appropriate 24-hour security of the exhibition spaces and storage/preparation areas, including intrusion alarm systems and locked cases or tamper-resistant mountings. Automatic fire detection and suppression systems must be in place. So this is a relatively high-level security agreement in a loan policy. Again, if you're in more of a collegial ongoing relationship, you may not necessarily be equipped to ask them to have the space monitored 24 hours, including intrusion alarm systems, et cetera, et cetera. But you do want to have some statement that the the borrowing institution is guaranteeing a certain level of security. So moving on now, we're going to get to somewhat of the nitty-gritty of looking at collection security. So we're thinking about all of these kind of policy-related, more bigger picture, some almost conceptual things about an overall security program. But what are some of the physical ways you can actually increase security, both on the inside and perimeter of the building or buildings in which your collections are housed. Security measures include conducting an inventory of the collections. If you don't know what you have, how would you know if it had been lost, misplaced, damaged, etc.? So inventories and varying levels of inventories are actually a security measure. Of course, security systems like centrally monitored alarm systems on doors, entryways, exits, etc. Restriction of access or key control, so identifying exactly who has access to certain spaces and when and sometimes why they are accessing those spaces. Camera systems like closed circuit systems. Actual physical interventions that you can take with the collections themselves, such as security mounting hardware for objects on exhibit, or book tagging for books that have, perhaps rare books or that are not supposed to circulate, or for circulating collections before they've been checked out. And locking display cases to restrict access of exhibited items. Segregating rare or valuable items. So this one also, to a certain extent, goes back to access control. So establishing levels of security parameters to put in place for different types of collections. The most rare and valuable items, of course, are going to be the ones that you are safeguarding the most intensively. And then finally, establishing a relationship with local first responders, such as the police and fire departments. We'll be discussing all of these measures in a little bit more detail as we go on. Conducting a physical inventory of the collections in your institution is incredibly important. Again, there's no way to know if material is missing if you aren't sure that it was there in the first place. I've often been on site visits to collections where staff think that a particular object has gone missing but can't necessarily prove it because an inventory has not been undertaken in many years, if at all. It is a time-consuming activity and can be really difficult, of course, if you have a large collection at your institution, if you have the kind of limited resources in terms of time and staffing that I know most of us are facing. But conducting an inventory to some extent is beneficial for so many reasons, not least because it is also a time where preservation priorities can also be flagged. It gives you that opportunity to look at, and in some cases even handle, all of your collections that are otherwise just sitting on the shelf or sitting in a cabinet or a drawer. So this is an opportunity to monitor collections as well as just find out what is on the shelf. This is an image of staff at the Chicago History Museum conducting a collections inventory on some of their three-dimensional objects. When we think of security systems for collections, you might think of really dramatic examples, films like Mission Impossible and The Entrapment, where people are lowered on strings above laser beams or have to climb through laser beams to get to a safe full of valuable documents. Generally speaking, of course, most collections do not have the budget for complex laser systems, but there are affordable security systems for many budgets. Even the most inexpensive system can act as a visual deterrent. If a potential thief or vandal sees a camera in place, they may reconsider. It's not necessarily going to stop someone, but if it makes anyone think twice, all the better. Security alarms essentially provide protection 24/7. They can also be connected to fire alarms. They can automatically alert first responders, or certain security systems, you can set them up to automatically alert a certain list of cell phone numbers. So key collection staff can get a notification if security is breached outside of working hours. There are systems for both perimeter security and interior security, and they can really be adapted to suit just about every institution, from the smallest to the largest. We've talked about this one a little bit along the way, but it's so important that I want to spend a little more time with it. Controlling access is one of the most important things you can do to keep collections secure. There are a few different ways you can do this with kind of varying degrees of technological sophistication. Card readers, of course, are an excellent way to control and monitor access to a building, an area within the building. This can be easy to monitor through computer-based access. The cards can be programmed to grant access for specific or limited amounts of time. And of course, they can be reprogrammed when security requirements change. The great thing about a key card system is that it automatically logs who and when is accessing certain spaces. So if there is a problem or question or concern down the road, you would know, you would be able to go back and see who was likely to have been in the space. The keyway of a key is the series of grooves on the side of the key that allows it to slide into the cylinder of a particular lock. The type of key that we have for our houses most likely has a common keyway configuration, which is what makes it easy for us to get keys cut at the supermarket or any old hardware store. But there are some types of keyways that can be created proprietarily for high security buildings, including museums. If more key blanks are needed, they can only be purchased from the distributor with special authorization. So these keys, of course, are going to be a lot more expensive, but it also prevents anyone with access to the key going to get a copy made. There are certain companies that provide this service. One that I know of, just for example, is called Hinsco Safe and Lock. I'm sure there are numerous others out there, but if you're interested in looking into this, I would look into proprietary keyways and see what you might be able to install for your building or for certain spaces within your building. And finally, again, we've talked about this along the way, but having a key control program in place restricts who has access. This can include our alarm codes as well as key cards or even just physical keys. Of course, it kind of goes without saying, the less people have access within reason, the more secure your collection is likely to be. Closed circuit cameras, they can also just act as a visual deterrent in the same way security systems might, and can also serve as an extra pair of eyes both during and after working hours. They can help monitor blind spots and areas where staff aren't realistically able to constantly observe visitors due to the layout of your space or the necessity of multitasking. You know, often staff, even in a research space, staff have to be helping researchers and retrieving items while keeping an eye on visitors, and that can make it difficult to closely observe the reading room. In a museum setting where you have multiple rooms and don't necessarily have docents or guards, you know, roaming throughout all the spaces, that can be certainly difficult to observe all the spaces as well. Security mirrors may not be as effective, but again, if your institution has multiple blind spots where staff can't see, this might be an relatively inexpensive way for staff to monitor these spaces. If your institution displays framed objects, security mounting hardware can help protect framed art or documents from being removed from the wall. You can purchase this type of hardware in a variety of configurations and even a variety of complexities. But simple security hardware is very low cost and effective. It provides more support during exhibition, and you can probably imagine makes it slightly more difficult to remove objects for the wall. For example, with some secure mounting hardware, only a specially designed screwdriver can be used to remove the particular screws holding frames to the wall, a bit like a lock and key. Sorry about that, I forgot to advance. Just some images of screws. This is primarily going to be for our library participants, but books and media can also be physically tagged electronically in a non-permanent way to keep people from walking out of the library without having the tag deactivated by staff. I think probably everybody has experienced what happens when you try to leave a library with a book that hasn't had its tag properly deactivated. So security strips can be placed in the spine of a book and are non-permanent. They use electromagnetic technology. Pressure-sensitive tags, such as RF or radio frequency tags, can be attached to mylar dust covers. Security cases for digital media, such as CDs or DVDs, can also have these tags attached, although it is possible in this case to remove the media inside, so maybe not quite as secure as actually tagging the item itself. An inexpensive alarm system, quote unquote, was suggested by an archivist that I've consulted with, using those entrance alert door chimes which detect motion. So it was suggested to place those in display cases or near valuable objects so that it alerts you if there's motion, which either shouldn't be there or just alerts you when people are close to particular objects. So these are incredibly cheap at hardware stores and can be set to a variety of different tones depending on what your staff might want to listen for. So I'm going to be talking a little bit in a moment about managing visitors in your collection space. And when we think about having alarm systems, motion detecting systems for when individuals are getting too close to an artifact or something, we're typically thinking of like fairly high-tech systems. It doesn't have to be that high-tech. Display cases with locking covers or doors can make a world of difference, particularly when a display area is in a blind spot or in a part of the institution which is unable to be monitored by staff. It's also ideal for very rare, valuable, and important objects on exhibit. So if you can't necessarily afford to purchase locking secure display cases for everything on exhibit, consider prioritizing and allocating accordingly. So many institutions will already have segregated areas for collections and storage, even in a library that has, browsing stacks, as well as they may also have more secure closed stacks for rare books and archival material. But for those who don't, it can be one of the best things you can do to secure your collection for a variety of reasons. Having a separate room for the storage of special collections or collections at all allows you to limit access to staff members or to carefully vetted researchers and volunteers. It's also beneficial for many other reasons aside from security, including environmental monitoring, housekeeping, and maintaining physically safe storage for the collections themselves. So all factors that are going to contribute to their long-term physical preservation. Again, I've talked about this a lot of times throughout the afternoon, but controlling access to storage is so crucial to the security of collections, and having segregated storage is possibly one of the best ways to do this. Ideally, you would want to keep any research or exhibition space completely separate from collection storage areas, which of course is not always possible, but to the extent that you can kind of segregate things, again, you might take a resource allocation prioritization approach and segregate the most valuable sensitive parts of the collection. And then finally, another basically free thing you can do to strengthen security is just to make contact with your local police or fire department. They may be able to come in and conduct a walkthrough of your space, of your collection spaces, highlighting any security risks they might notice that might not be immediately visible to people who are in the space every day. It also allows you to build a relationship and introduce them to your collections so that they're familiar with your institution and your staff and volunteers, which is going to be especially valuable in the case of theft or vandalism. And it's also an important step in the process of emergency preparedness. If your institution is working on emergency planning, you're going to definitely need to engage with your local first responders through that process. So this can be a way of kind of killing two birds with one stone. So if you've increased your security by installing alarms, locking display cases, and updating your policies, you still have two big variables to consider, and they're both around people. The people visiting your collection and the people working with your collection. So first, we'll touch on the importance of managing visitors. And I'm splitting visitors up between researchers, so folks who are actually using and directly interacting with collections, and exhibit viewers. So first we'll talk about researchers. So a lot of this we kind of touched on already in the access and handling and use policy, but just to reiterate a little bit, a security policy and access and handling policy should outline the procedures for managing researchers. Having a written policy in place establishes firm guidelines and best practices so that staff and visitors are on the same page. It gives staff members and volunteers something to point to if a researcher or potential researcher has a question about a certain policy. You can say, well, see, it's right here in our security policy. So ideally, researchers directly accessing the collections should provide some form of photo ID, complete a registration form, or sign a logbook that is, some record of them accessing the collections on that particular date. Have rules for the use and handling of the materials explained, including potentially written guidelines for the correct physical handling of materials. And space permitting, if possible, researchers should be asked to store large coats and bags. Food and drink may also be part of your security policy, for example, by not allowing liquid or food into a reading room. Staff are key in this to carrying out procedures to safely manage visitors accessing the collection. They should be vigilant about watching who and what enters and leaves a research space, and should really monitor the use of materials while being accessed by visitors. Some institutions require a search of researchers' belongings upon leaving. Not everyone is comfortable with this, but I've found that patrons and researchers are usually very understanding. I mean, if they are operating with goodwill and good intention, it's in their best interest to kind of cooperate and support the security and preservation of collections. They know that you're trying to keep their collection safe and secure, and most see it as a necessary inconvenience. And if they act funny about it, that might be an indication that you need to talk to them a little further. So moving on to individuals accessing collections primarily through exhibit. Even if your museum or exhibit space is free, make some contact with everyone so they know that in kind of the positive way of framing it, they know that you're there so they can ask questions, but also so they know that you're watching them, and ideally on the way in and out. So again, even if it's free, even if they don't have to necessarily engage with someone to pay to come in, have someone greet them on their way in, and then, you know, say goodbye and thank you on their way out. Ensure clear sight lines. Make sure there aren't pockets or corners where visitors are completely out of staff, volunteers, cameras, etc. Of course, human presence in galleries is going to be a major deterrent. So if all tours are guided, or if you have security personnel actually in the space, all the better in terms of deterrent. But I know that realistically, based on resources and staffing and volunteer levels, that's not always possible. Plan out entry and exit routes for individuals to move throughout the space if it's a multi-room exhibit space. Ideally, entry and exits should both be through the same point. So even if your museum is in somewhat of a loop or on multiple floors, it's just a lot easier to monitor who's going in and out if you only have to monitor one point, rather than having, for example, the entry to an exhibit be at the front of the museum and the exit be at the back. Consider limiting the number of visitors in the space at a time. This might not always be feasible. It might not even always be necessary, depending on how highly trafficked your space is, how large your space is. But particularly if you do have a smaller space, if you do have exhibits that are really densely packed with a lot of small objects, you might want to consider having numbers of individuals allowed at any given time. And then finally, we talked a little bit already about motion detection alarms. So in order to deter visitors from getting close enough to touch or damage pieces, even if inadvertently. So finally, the thing nobody wants to talk about is in-house security risks. In 2008, the FBI noted that 90% of theft within museums is internal. This is a really tricky, unfortunate area because, of course, nobody wants to assume that their colleagues and friends and trusted volunteers are capable of threat. But it is very important to put, capable of theft, but it is very important to put some safeguards in place. So this brings us to one of the many stories of archival theft that I wanted to share, that of Sandy Berger. Sandy Berger, oh, this is a very low-res image, sorry about that. In 2003, Sandy Berger, who is a former national security advisor, stuffed 5 classified documents into his socks and pants in the National Archives reading room prior to testifying before the 9/11 Commission. He had been given access to original, unphotocopied, and uninventoried documents related to terrorism, and he removed them and hid them under a trailer on a construction site before coming back for them years later. He was given a $50,000 fine and 2 years of probation and community service. So definitely an inside job, very unfortunate one. Many of the ways to mitigate internal risks are probably things that your institution is already considering. This includes key control, beginning to sound like a broken record on that one, but conducting reference checks on new employees, regularly conducting inventories of the collection, monitoring what comes into or leaves the collection with staff. Some institutions, I'm definitely not recommending everyone go out and put this into place, but some institutions search all of their staff upon leaving work every day. Installing security cameras, and stratifying the way information is allocated to staff members. I'm not promoting complete opacity here, but essentially access to information should be given on the basis of necessity, especially when it includes potential areas of security issues. We're almost done. So before I take some questions, I just wanted to recap some of the low or no cost security techniques that you might be able to implement, begin to implement anyway, right away. It's great to have high-tech sensors and alarms, but some of the most effective things you can do not require a huge monetary expenditure. They may require time and institutional buy-in, which I know are incredibly important resources. So it's easier said than done to suggest that these things are easy to implement. They just might be relatively lower cost. And then finally, here is a simple overview of the process of increasing the level of security at your collection. Form some security committee, could just be one person, but have some committee or individual tasked with exploring and strengthening security at your organization. Perform a security survey and assessment. From that survey and assessment, make a security plan. Update and develop your policies accordingly. Tackle the areas with the most immediate need first. Not only the low-hanging fruit, but the most pressing, urgent concerns. And of course, as with anything in collections, policies and procedures, reassess and reevaluate regularly. Circumstances are going to change. What might have been your security situation in January may be completely different by July, so just keep on top of it. The final tale of archival theft today is about a husband and wife team, Samuel George Matz and Elizabeth Matz. These were actually just two of the names they went by in their career of stealing and reselling archival documents in the 1960s. Samuel actually posed as a journalist to spend time researching at the US National Archives, during which time he smuggled archival documents out in his wife's handbag and sold them, meeting undercover detectives inside of a Kroger grocery store. In 1969, they were finally arrested in Detroit and charged with stealing 210 historical documents from the National Archives, and both went to jail. So I know both of the examples I gave were from the National Archives. It doesn't just happen there. It happens, unfortunately, all over the place. So better safe than sorry. Look at your security systems, make adjustments where you can. And with that, I have time for questions. So please go ahead and either type a question in the Q&A box or in the chat bar. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, can't guarantee I will be able to fully answer all of your questions during this session. I mean, because of not only time, but my knowledge. But I'm always happy to kind of take questions and get back to you at a later date if there are things that I need to dig a little deeper on. So I have both the chat and Q&A boxes open now. Just gonna wait and see if anyone starts typing, and we can go from there. Again, if you do have questions that you want to just send me directly after this webinar, please feel free to email me. My email address is up on the screen right now, or you can give me a call. That's my direct line on the screen right now. We will be sending out an email following the webinar with those 4 documents that I'd like for all of you to see. They're related to security in both museums and library archive collections. So hopefully a little bit of something for almost everyone. Yeah. One of the downsides of this webinar software, some softwares I can see when folks are typing, so I can anticipate that a question is coming. I cannot see that in this software, so I just have to kind of awkwardly. Oh, great. Yeah. Thank you, Stu. I appreciate your stress on key control. Well, good, because I know I know I stress it a lot, but sometimes that's kind of the first step that you can take, is and not even at the point of necessarily restricting access, but just understanding access, knowing who has access to your building, or if there are certain differently secured spaces within your building. Gaining that knowledge of who has the access is a really important first step in increasing security, because if you just don't know everyone who has keys, who has alarm codes to a security system, then you're flying a lot more blind than you are if you are at least armed with that knowledge. And then from there, you can potentially begin to limit or restrict access. But, you know, again, even before you get to that point, just knowing who has it is crucial. Oh gosh, yeah. Stu also writes, at a law enforcement themed museum where I worked, my boss used to stress the need to watch the watchers. We actually had one of our security guards steal some artifacts from us. Fortunately, we were able to recover them. Well, that is I'm very glad to hear that part of the story. But yeah, that stings. That's terrible. And again, just highlights that kind of very uncomfortable fact of the frequency of the inside job. But that's probably the most painful spin on an inside job, is having security guards. Yeah, I guess you can't be too careful. Right, well, you never know. But I'm really glad you were able to recover the the stolen artifacts. That's great. Well, I do hope that I'm not missing anyone who's still typing, but at the same time, I don't want you all to have to kind of sit through my awkward waiting for questions chatter. So I am going to call it. Please, I'll stick around for another few minutes just to make sure that no other questions come in if there's anything burning, but barring that, please reach out directly via email or phone with questions. Our next RHSP webinar should be able to register for that one now as well, but it is going to be on also on a Wednesday, February 26th, and that's going to be on housekeeping for collections. Oh, someone asked if we will be sending a certificate of completion to attendees. That's not normally part of the practice, everyone doesn't automatically get a certificate of completion, but if that's something that you need or want just for your records, we can definitely send that along. Please send me an email just so I have your name and contact information if that's something that you are interested in. And yes, we can definitely write something up and send a certificate of completion, you know, if you need it for your employer or just for your records. That is easy to handle. So. All right. Like I said, I'm going to call it. I definitely am happy to take questions directly via email, but I'm going to attempt to stop. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you again at a future webinar.